Good afternoon. Welcome to a two-part panel on new diplomacy for new conflicts, as tentatively has been described. In the description of the panel, you may see that it deals with a new volume that is soon to be out. And it's a special issue in the Journal of Global Policy. And the first part of this panel is going to introduce the main ideas that have been at the core of this special issue. It is my distinct pleasure to introduce the panelists of today. On my far right is Professor Emeritus Bill Zartman from Johns Hopkins University School of Advanced International Studies, one of the pioneers of the field of conflict resolution and a relentless worker on publishing as much as possible, as quickly as possible. In the middle of the panel is Valerie Rosoux, a professor from Université Louvain in Belgium, an expert in reconciliation processes, and Mikhail Troitskiy, director of the MIGIMO Institute for International Affairs in Moscow. All three members of very unique group of experts and scholars of international negotiations called PIN, Processes of International Negotiations, which is now hosted at GIGA. My name is Siniša Vuković. I'm Associate Director of the Conflict Management Program at Johns Hopkins University School of Advanced International Studies, and I will moderate today's session. Without further ado, I would like to give the floor to Professor Zartman, who is going to introduce the volume and set the stage for our further discussions. Professor Zartman.
Thank you. Does that carry? Yeah. Okay, I don't know whether the organizers of this conference realized the double entendre that they had in the classy title that they gave to this, Navigating Through Disruption. That is, obviously, finding your way through the disruption. But it also means, and this is what we want to focus on, navigating by means of disruption. And that's very much the topic that we're looking at. We're no longer in a system of world order, we're in a system of world disorder, in which entropy is rising tremendously at a number of different levels. We have a multi-state system with non-ideological power plays, both on the international level and on the regional level. There's no blocks, there's no hegemon, and what the players like above all to find is vacuums that they can move into before somebody else moves in to fill the vacuums for power reasons. There's normative chaos in the current system. As somebody said earlier in one of the sessions, the rules and norms that we all believe in are being dismantled as we speak. And that was a very good, in an earlier session, introduction to what we're talking about. Norms? What norms are we talking about? Norms of the conquest of territory, the treatment of refugees and IDPs, and treatment of dissidents, international territorial integrity, weapons of mass destruction, trade practices, national self-determination, protection of population, humanitarian assistance are all subject to crumbling norms. International regimes are also melting down. International regimes on international trade, on non-proliferation, on climate change, on security through the United Nations Security Council, the ICC, and of territorial waters. We no longer go by organizations that carry out norms on these important subjects. State dysfunction is rampant in many parts of the world. The states aren't breaking apart as they used to, a secessionist section, but they're crumbling into little pieces, and non-state armed groups are taking over security functions within pieces of the state with no goal particularly in mind. Non-state and proto-state actors are impervious to international attempts to try to bring a conflict under control. They don't care. They continue and do what they want. Again, I say rather aimlessly. And finally, there's the rise of national disasters. National disasters are always around for us, but they're not not disasters because of nature, but because of what man does not do about them. Opioid, drought, migratory fish, cholera, and water deficiency for some states. In addition, even more striking perhaps for the interests of all of us here, in the last decade, there have been a number of striking attempts, serious attempts at conflict management that have failed. Not simply conflicts that continue, but at attempts to bring the conflict under control and that have broken down or not gotten anywhere. I needn't remind you of the list of them: Yemen and Libya and Syria and the GCC and Somalia and South Sudan and northern Nigeria and Mali and the Central African Republic and Afghanistan, and in the Philippines, Abu Sayyaf and the NPA, and then when you get off land in the South China Sea. Attempts made to bring conflicts under control that have failed. Why? And it's striking that they all have some common elements that have kept them from arriving at some kind of reconciliation. First of all, they're all stalemated, but the stalemate doesn't hurt. And the countries either arm themselves against hurt or won't feel it, or else they're helped from the outside so that the hurt isn't felt so bad, and so we don't have a ripe situation for resolution. There are no searches for trade-offs. One side is saying, I won't accept anything that you're offering me because you're bad and shouldn't be there anyhow. And so people are not looking for trade-offs to resolve the conflict. And at the same time, there's no interest in reframing the conflict in such a way that perhaps we can redefine it in a way that's beneficial to both of us. There's no support for the mediator. And the Security Council sends out mediators, cuts his hands off, and tries to walk through this conflict as best you can, cuts his feet off, in fact. So that you have Kofi Annan coming up with his guidelines in Syria. The UNSC did not publish those guidelines for 2 years. A striking example of mediators set out without any support from the mandating agency. And then outside states are interested not in conflict management, but in the conflict. And they see a vacuum and a role to play there, either for proxies or simply to keep other states from getting in there. And so we have navigating by means of disruption. Somebody earlier today said, what are the little things that we can do to change the momentum? And our project here is trying to come up with little things, not systems of world order that we put in place by fiat, but little things that we can do to make a difference. And I'll just tick them off in the same haste that I've talked about the earlier problems. It's important to return to the idea of state building. It's important to build states internationally. It's important to build problem-solving groups, that is, groups of states and NGOs who are interested in solving a problem without waiting for a mandate from the UN. It's important to give mediators support, again, by individual states who are interested, even if the UN falls through, as it does. It's important to build multilateral coalitions to deal with problems, including coalitions of the willing, when a legal coalition is not legal by institutional laws. It's important to bring together teams of rivals, states that are competing over a particular issue or conflict or place, and say, okay, you all have different aims, but let's try to see if we can't meet somewhere to bring this under control and to stop the killing of human beings, as we did in Cambodia in '90, or as we tried to do a good process with the six-party talks in Korea. It's important to encourage regional security communities so that states in a region get together, share defense information, pledge not to attack each other, and then turn to solving their problems in this type of increased security situation. These are all procedural suggestions that we might take up and apply in various places, and there are some substantive suggestions as well. It's worthwhile thinking about reviving historical mechanisms, such as marches or neutral zones or autonomy or non-sovereign self-government. or self-determination. It's important to pay attention to status concerns, because many of the conflicts that we see now are people whose status has been insulted, they feel, with a historic background. It's important to develop mechanisms for the accountability of humanitarian aid. Humanitarian aid goes to Southern Sudan. It goes to the rulers of Southern Sudan. It never gets to the humanitarian targets. It all goes into their pockets, and then we wonder why they can't find a solution to the conflict. It's important to work with local communities. If the government is unmanageable, it's important to get into local communities and help strengthen them, as the United States, for example, did with Zaire back in the last days of Mobutu. It's important to pay attention to postvention. That is prevention by attention to what happens after an agreement, because we tend to make an agreement and go home satisfied that the job is open. And it's important, and more broadly, to restore the level of permissibility, to raise the threshold of what one dare not do, so that we can think of normative limitations on our actions. And I could go on. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Professor Zartman. Valerie,
Thank
your
you.
paper was on reconciliation processes in the Middle East. Would you like to share some thoughts about that?
Limits of reconciliation, more. Thank you very much, Siniša. Yes, the question is rather simple. What is the role of mediators in dealing with the past, basically? And the starting point is the following. In the aftermath of violent conflict, the significance of memory issues is paramount. The Israeli-Palestinian case is very telling in this regard. The succession of crises and tensions oversimplified and radicalized narratives of both sides. And today the representations of the past are not only diverging, but incompatible. Think about the interpretations given to the 1948 war, or to the origins of the Palestinian refugee question, or to the plaza of the mosques in Jerusalem. So all these examples illustrate the gap between contradictory narratives. So the question is, how can mediators address contradictory narratives? Well, I suggest in the article to maybe take into consideration 3 potential attitudes. The first one could be summarized by the formula neither nor. It's a tabula rasa attitude, if you want, neither the Israeli representation nor the Palestinian one. And the argument is simple. There is a risk that telling stories of the violence may justify the next round of violence. So it's wise not to explicitly address the past. That was the explicit argument during the Oslo process. Negotiators explained that they could debate the past for years and never agree. So the objective was to agree about the future, and they conceal all the references to the past. I would have a lot of examples. I have another one, just one concrete example. Bill Clinton confirmed this position during the Camp David talks. One of the Palestinian negotiators referred to the situation that followed the Shoah in Europe to justify the call for compensation for what happened in 1948. And this analogy, this historical analogy, was instantly rejected by the Israeli negotiator, who considered that both contexts were fundamentally different. And Bill Clinton agreed, of course, we cannot compare. So that was really the attitude, let us not argue about the past. First attitude, well, in the field, the concealment of historical narratives does not mean that the emotions, not the narrative, but the emotions that are attached to the narratives can disappear. It can be concealed like that as well. So from a psychological perspective, that's interesting to see that all social psychology studies demonstrate that children of the second, the third, and the fourth generations still have strong feelings of resentment, shame, guilt, and victimization, especially when past injustices have not been addressed by their parent generation. That's something that we work on that with a team in Louvain, the University of Louvain, and it's obvious. So a second attitude might also be considered. Not the tabula rasa, just the opposite. Would be a kind of juxtaposition. We say that in English as well, right? So not neither nor, but we take all the interpretations of the past. What do I mean? That the mediators consider that they are neither judges nor historians, so that they should respect all the interpretations. I give you an example, concrete one. Jacques Chirac, former French president, who was talking and listening to Yasser Arafat. At that time, it was just after, in the aftermath of Camp David, and Yasser Arafat was explaining that there was no trace, literally, there is no trace of any Jewish temple in Jerusalem. You know the argument. And then Jacques Chirac intervened quite brutally to say, the point is not to know whether these ruins exist or not. It is to respect the representation of the other side. So here it's, okay, this is their representation, you have another representation, and we take them all, and we combine them. There is a textbook, a history textbook that was based on this principle, made by 6 historians coming from both sides, and the outcome that they could reach was, for each page, 3 columns with the Israeli narrative of 1948 or any event, blank, and then the Palestinian narrative, and each student could make comments between the 2 narratives. So, first attitude, neither nor. Second attitude, both interpretations of the past. Third attitude, new common interpretation of the past. Much more ambitious. I would call that kind of zigzag between the notions. So it's on the one hand, on the other one. So much more ambitious, yes, since the purpose is really to develop a shared vision and to go to better form stories. It's a re-examination, and you know it requires to go beyond denial and to acknowledge not only the fact but also responsibility. Well, we can have discussion about that. It's a huge, huge question. To me, it's far too ambitious, to be honest. And I would like to go to the conclusion, because I feel a kind of pressure coming from my right. The initial question was, if mediators can reconfigure incompatible narratives, and to me the answer is no. The Israeli-Palestinian case reminds us that third parties cannot control narratives of the past. Yet, third parties have a role to play to remind the parties that their narratives are not stable and fixed once and for all. They are stories under construction, right? And ultimately, I think that the question to me is probably not about changing narratives, the way parties talk about the issues, but rather maybe changing postures in terms of loyalty, and it's one single question. In whose name do negotiators refer to the past? To whom should they keep their promises? To past, current, and/or future generations? You could argue, but it's not incompatible. Well, that's not so easy. But I guess that consideration of children and grandchildren can bring a dose of much needed creativity and flexibility. So one last question for each of you. Isn't it crucial to honor, no, it is crucial to honor past generation, but isn't it even more fundamental to protect the interest of those to come? That's it.
Thank you, Valerie. Thank you. Mikhail, I won't introduce your paper. I think you'll do better justice than I do. So.
Yeah, thank you, Siniša, and good afternoon. Thank you, everyone, for coming. So, as a Russian should probably do, I wrote a policy-oriented discussion piece for the journal addressing the challenges to regional conflict management arising from great power rivalry. And the most conflict-ridden great power relations are those between the established great powers, the United States, and to the extent the European Union, on one hand, and those powers that we call aspiring. And aspiring doesn't mean rising; it just means dissatisfied with its current status and wanting more. Okay, so aspiring and global powers often leverage against each other the conflicts that occur in the neighborhoods of those aspiring powers, the neighborhoods such as the South China Sea or post-Soviet Eurasia. So, as we all know, China and Russia consider those regions their spheres of special, or say, privileged historical zones of special interest, irrespective of the legal grounds for such a view. But the United States and the European Union are, of course, also interested in those contested regions because of their trade and investment, because of their security concerns, diaspora politics, pressure groups, from the pressure from the expert community, and other groups that have strong views about the global powers policy towards those regions. And so, as Professor Zartman just noticed, at the end of the Cold War, we witnessed some surprising comity among or between the two superpowers that actually ended up sorting out cooperatively quite a few conflicts across the globe, be it Cambodia in Asia or Angola in Africa, places in Central America, and so forth. But over the following 2 decades, this spirit of comity, the spirit of cooperation in managing regional conflicts has somehow dissipated, faded out. So we are now faced with the need for some new conflict resolution mechanisms, or at least some ideas as to how we can overcome either escalating or simmering conflicts in those contested neighborhoods or in some more remote places like Syria. And essentially, the puzzle is, as I think Professor Zartman also just hinted, the puzzle is whether the leading powers, the US and the EU, could concede some status to the aspiring powers in return for the aspiring powers actually cooperating in the mediation of those regional disputes. And whether and how, and how much the regional powers can appreciate the benefits of conflicts actually being resolved while they receive credit for their resolution. So that is something, these are the factors on which the actual willingness of the parties to jointly manage those regional conflicts and resolve them may actually depend. And you certainly cannot think in terms of grand bargains that would delineate geographic areas of responsibility or not speaking about spheres of influence. But what could perhaps be tried, and I'm trying to play with this notion in my article, is a web of negotiation fora that would span and transcend the spots and the regions that are contested by global and aspiring powers. And negotiation, in a way, is a pragmatic give and take, right? So it doesn't compromise any principles, neither does it imply interference in domestic affairs? And we already have some negotiation fora in place, such as the OSCE, NATO-Russia Council, Shanghai Cooperation Organization, and so forth in Eurasia. But we need more comprehensive platforms. So we were asked to be normative in our pieces written for the journal. So I played with the idea that we could perhaps formalize some regular security consultations involving the United States, Russia, and China, and any number of relevant stakeholders in post-Soviet Eurasia or broader Eurasia, depending on the issue under discussion. Perhaps Belt and Road countries plus the United States, then some key EU members and the EU as a whole could also form a negotiation platform. And perhaps we could also think in terms of trade zones plus that could involve China, the European Union, and some states in post-Soviet Eurasia, Asia, and Europe. So the point is that such a web of bilateral and multilateral fora could be relied upon as at least a canary in the coal mine of conflict. It is supposed to be on what the international relations scholar Robert Cohen called diffuse reciprocity, and that is the aspiring powers whose status is being elevated would have to honor the concerns of the global powers to keep those valued negotiation fora running. And of course there are plenty of stumbling blocks, there are plenty of obstacles that you need to overcome in order to put those fora in place, or even make this proposal realistic. And I guess you would first need to tackle the widespread conviction among on one hand, the global powers and aspiring powers on the other hand, convictions about their mutual weakening. So you think that the other party is actually in decline while your clout is actually increasing, and of course, you don't want to negotiate and compromise now if you are getting relatively stronger. So you need to address those narratives in virtually all of those nations that would somehow prioritize, that would somehow reflect the beliefs of their own rise while their opponents are believed to be declining. And second, we do have a fundamental lack of trust. For example, you can believe that your negotiation counterpart is never amenable to compromise, has no track record of compromise. And that look to be the actual mutual perspectives of the policymakers in the United States, in China, in Russia, and it ruins any possibility of good faith negotiation. But hopefully, and that's my kind of bottom line, hopefully there's this mighty challenge of the rising cost of uncertainty that is going to actually challenge those convictions. So you're going to have uncertainty. You're going to face it if you really plan on waiting your opponent out. And so the actual trends in the distribution of power are much more complicated than someone's linear rise or decline, or someone's belief in a linear rise or decline. And so as we look back at history, we'll see that the aspiring powers have successfully negotiated their way into a number of core multilateral institutions on more than one occasion. Look at the World Trade Organization and China, or Russia and the Council of Europe. And there's no reason why that experience of overcoming hurdles to mutual accommodation cannot be replicated, cannot be repeated. Thank you.
Thank you, Mikhail. I will try to expedite the Q&A and just jump on it. And I would like to invite you to join us at slido.com, as you can see on the big screen, and please post your questions as we go by. Valerie, I think this question was intended to you, but please, everyone is more than welcome to jump in. The question goes, what do you mean by changing the narrative of the past, especially when it comes to the Palestinian case? Is there any suggestion, at least on a policy level, how this could be done and potentially expanded to other examples that are similarly salient and difficult to fathom?
In the Palestinian-Israeli case, I have one very concrete example, maybe, and otherwise I will give an example in another case. During the Taba conference in 2001, Israeli negotiators explicitly considered the right of return of Palestinian refugees, and one of them started to acknowledge the Palestinian tragedy. That was the first ever reference at this level of negotiation, and it was really a shift in the negotiations, and this shift was made possible. That's what we can see in the testimony of the negotiator. This shift was made possible thanks to the work of the so-called new historians in Israel. Do you remember it? A long time ago. But and it's not the current trend anymore. But this was an official shift, if you want. Another one which is more stable, I hope. When Jacques Chirac in France in 1996 explicitly asked for apologizes on behalf of France for the Jewish raffles of the Vel d'If, that was a major shift in the narrative that was stressed in France, and we have plenty of cases like that. I don't know whether it makes sense or...
Thank you very much. Last question, if I may just jump in, and following up on Professor Zartman's and Mikhail's remarks, can you just briefly remind us why is it so problematic to create grand systems over again, and why should we focus on the more regional or local realities instead?
Well, I think from my side that on the part of both parties, there's a disinterest in grand systems. There's a feeling that the grand systems, the last being the bipolar system, or for the United States, the unipolar system, were ineffective, were demanded too much of us, didn't pay enough attention to us. So we felt badly served by the previous institution, constrained by them. And then we were surprised on both sides to see that the other side, taking advantage of that vacuum of commitment, and commitment is power, vacuum of commitment, to jump in and fill the vacuum. There's an absolute rule of politics that vacuums will be filled. Then when you have status questions, as both Mikhail and I noted, then it's obvious that there are candidates to fill that vacuum, and then this increases the disillusion and distrust of the parties with a global type of system.
Yeah, we do have grand systems in place. We have the United States and its allies. We have this transatlantic relationship. We have more or less, the European Union and the United States with their global kind of purview. But my argument was rather that in order to resolve some proxy conflicts or conflicts that risk for which there's a risk of becoming proxy, actually, we need to strike a balance, or the right balance, between, on the one hand, the scope of the stakeholders, the number of stakeholders that we want to bring to the table to discuss those conflicts on one hand, and here I advocate for trans-regional approaches to discussing those conflicts, because only then you may be able to address the whole gamut of issues arising from seemingly local conflicts, but the one that has trans-regional repercussions. So you have this number of stakeholders that you involve on the one hand, and on the other hand, that has to be balanced against the depth of engagement of those stakeholders in a negotiation fora, in an arrangement, let's say, that is going to address those regional issues. And here we are not going to anything very much institutionalized is not going to work, is not going to fly. No binding institutions are not going to work. So I was thinking in terms of just showing goodwill in negotiation fora with a fairly broad number of participants that would value those fora as a platform for interaction, for negotiation, and perhaps I thought that could be an optimal way of addressing those regional conflicts that are long-standing, that are becoming intractable, and that have more and more features of being, proxy conflicts and actually being embedded into the international structures and the system.
Thank you, Michael. Last question, because we have to introduce another group, and it goes back to the issue of narratives. Do the narratives of the past actually shape the idea of nationalism and collective memory? So I wouldn't say that they're mutually exclusive. And if yes, how?
Not by definition. A narrative is ambivalent, and memory is ambivalent, so it's neither positive nor negative as such. It depends on the objective which is pursued. But in the aftermath of mass atrocities, you don't have spontaneously a narrative which is not nationalistic. You see what I mean? Because you are just focusing on your victims, and I completely understand that from a psychological perspective. What is interesting is maybe the shift in the German narrative, if there is a so-called German narrative, I mean, strategic narrative. When I say, just to come back to a detail in the presentation, I said the Israeli representation and the Palestinian. Of course, there is no like a kind of two homogeneous and standardized narratives, but there are less and less dissonances and creative voices, I have to say, though. And so it really, I think that there are two major factors to know whether it is nationalistic or not, or nationalist. First, timing. When are we? Not how many years, but how many generations after the violence? And second factor, leadership. Leadership is key.
Thank you very much, Valerie. Please join me in a round of applause for our first group of panelists in presenting this special issue. And I would like to recommend that you look into the special issue, because the articles are now out on Wiley website, and on the website of Global Policy we will have flyers that you can take with you to see the very impressive collection of work, policy-relevant work by academics and academics on the issues that are most pertinent for today's global order. Thank you very much. And let me now